Have you ever been told the story of the 10 plagues as if it were a mere fable, a series of unfortunate natural disasters narrated to children? If so, you have been lied to. Forget the sanitized, colorful versions of the Exodus. What truly unfolded in the shadows of the 18th dynasty, at the very peak of the Pharaoh's occult power, was not a simple liberation. It was a cosmic war, a ritualistic, systematic execution of the very deities the Egyptians worshipped. When the heavens opened, it wasn't just rain or frogs falling, it was the judgment of the Almighty tearing down the pillars of a pagan empire. Imagine the Nile, the magnificent lifeblood of a civilization. When those waters turned to crimson, it wasn't just a chemical reaction or red silt from the mountains. It was the literal blood of the god Hapi being spilled before the eyes of a terrified nation. Every drop was a scream of a dying deity, a testament that their protector was bleeding out in the sun. But even that horror paled in comparison to the darkness that followed. A darkness so thick it could be felt as a physical weight pressing against the skin, a void that swallowed not just light, but the very air in the lungs. In those moments of absolute silence, screams began to echo from dimensions that modern science refuses to acknowledge. These were the heralds of the Mashhit, the destroyer, the sentencing shadow sent to claim what pride refused to surrender. This is the real story of Moses and the night the gods of Egypt fell. Are you ready to witness the true cost of arrogance? Do you realize that the version of history we were taught is merely a surface-level shadow of a much darker reality? For centuries, the profound knowledge hidden within these ancient texts was deliberately omitted because it was considered far too disturbing for the masses. This video is dedicated to those who seek the raw, unfiltered truth of the manuscripts. If you are one of the few who dare to face these revelations, subscribe to our channel now and like this video. Do not lose your access to these ancient secrets being revealed. The golden sands of the 18th dynasty did not just hide treasures, they concealed the most potent sorcery the world had ever known. In this era, Egypt was more than a kingdom. It was a cosmic anchor, where the pharaoh stood as the divine pillar holding the sun aloft. The priests of Ra and the necromancers of Anubis whispered incantations that bent the very fabric of reality, believing their power was absolute. But a storm was gathering in the horizon of the soul, one that the gilded temples of Thebes could not withstand. Into this world of shadow and stone stepped Moses. He was no stranger to these halls of power. Raised in the shimmering shadow of the throne, he was an initiate in the deepest secrets of the palace. A man who once understood the rhythm of the Nile and the names of the ancient shadows. Yet when he returned from the burning silence of the desert, he did not come with the subtle whispers of Egyptian magic. He carried the raw, unadulterated authority of the Creator, a power that did not just challenge the Pharaoh, but systematically dismantled the spiritual sentinels that had enslaved Israel for centuries. The plagues were not mere accidents of nature, they were ritualistic executions of the gods themselves. When the Nile turned to crimson, it was the literal life force of the deity Hapi being drained before the eyes of his worshippers. As the air grew thick with a darkness so heavy it could be felt against the skin, a terrifying physical manifestation of judgment began to take shape. This was the prelude to the arrival of the Mashhit, the destroyer. We have been told a sanitized version of this story for far too long. Today, we peel back the veil to reveal the terrifying truth of the night when the gods of Egypt fell. The air in Memphis did not just grow cold, it grew heavy, thick with the scent of stagnant water and old, forgotten secrets. You have been told a version of this story that is sanitized, a Sunday school tale of a man with a wooden staff and a pharaoh with a stubborn heart. But that is a lie born of comfort. What happened in the shadow of the pyramids was not a mere political dispute. It was a cosmic war, a systematic slaughter of the gods by the one who created the stars. Can you feel it? The vibration in the ground? That is not the wind. That is the sound of an ancient entity, the Mashhit, the destroyer, stretching its wings after centuries of slumber, waiting for the signal to descend. Every stone in Egypt began to weep, for the foundations of their magic were about to be shattered. This was the night the magic died, and the true nightmare began. If you are afraid of the dark, look away now, because the darkness we are about to describe is not the absence of light. It is a living, breathing creature that devours the soul. This is the truth of the Exodus, the part they were too terrified to put in the books. The plagues were not accidents, they were executions. And I, who witnessed the foundations of the world being laid, tell you that Egypt was the first to realize that their gods were nothing but masks for demons. The hunt has begun. Do not turn away from the truth that has been hidden for millennia. We are unveiling the darkest chapters of human history, where the supernatural becomes reality. If you seek to understand the hidden forces that shape our world and want to witness the ultimate triumph of light over the most ancient shadows, subscribe now. Join our circle of seekers, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment below. Your support allows us to keep bringing these forbidden revelations to light. Egypt, in the height of the 18th dynasty, was the epicenter of the world's most potent sorceries. This was not a land of simple farmers, but a kingdom built on the back of Hakau, the words of power. The pharaoh was not just a king, he was a living god, a conduit for the energies of the Nile and the sun. Into this fortress of occult absolute power stepped Moses. He did not come as the prince they once knew, dressed in fine linen and gold. He came as a stormbringer, a man whose eyes had seen the burning bush and had been seared by the holiness of the unutterable name. Beside him was Aaron, and before them stood the most powerful sorcerers of the age, Jannes and Jambres. These were men who had bartered their souls for the secrets of the abyss, capable of twisting reality with a whisper. They stood in the golden court, confident in their demons, unaware that they were about to face the architect of the universe. The air crackled with the friction of two opposing spiritual kingdoms clashing. The magicians laughed, believing their rituals could bind any spirit Moses served. They were wrong. They were catastrophically wrong. The war had begun, and the first casualties would be the very deities they worshipped. The duel began not with words, but with a sign that defied the laws of nature. Aaron cast down his staff, and it became a serpent, not a mere illusion, but a living, breathing creature of scales and venom. Jannes and Jambres, with their faces painted in the sigils of the underworld, whispered their incantations. Using the left-hand path of ancient Egyptian magic, they tapped into the chaotic energies of the Duat, and their staffs too became serpents. For a moment, it seemed the powers were equal. But then, the horror began for the Egyptians. Aaron's serpent did not merely fight, it consumed. It unhinged its jaws and swallowed the magician's serpents whole, symbolizing the total absorption of their power. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained a stone. So the first execution was ordered. Moses stood by the Nile, the lifeblood of the empire. He struck the water. In an instant, the god Hapi, the spirit of the Nile, was murdered. The river did not just turn red, it turned into literal, pulsing, warm human blood. The stench was unbearable. The very water that gave life became a source of death, a rotting vein of gore that stretched across the land. The fish died and floated like white, bloated eyes on a sea of crimson. The Egyptians, desperate for a drop of water, had to dig deep into the earth, clawing at the dirt with bleeding fingernails, while the magicians tried to replicate the miracle with their own jars of water, only to find that every drop they touched turned to putrefaction in their hands. But the mockery of the gods was only beginning. Next came Heket, the goddess of fertility and birth, depicted with the head of a frog. She was supposed to be the protector of mothers, the one who oversaw the breath of life. Moses stretched out his hand, and the goddess was turned into an abomination. Frogs did not just emerge from the river, they erupted like a living plague of boils. They filled the ovens, the beds, the very bowls where the grain was kept. It was a literal suffocating carpet of cold, slimy skin. And when they died, they did not disappear. They rotted in great mountainous heaps that infected the air. The mother of birth had become the mother of decay. The scent of millions of decomposing frogs filled the nostrils of the priests, making their rituals impossible. They could not remain pure for their gods while surrounded by such filth. The magicians Jannes and Jambres tried to summon more frogs, only adding to the misery of their own people, proving that their magic could only destroy, never heal. Then came the third blow, the one that broke the pride of the sorcerers. Moses commanded the dust of the land to be struck. In an instant, every grain of sand, every speck of dust in the desert-choked land, transformed. It became kinnim, lice or gnats. This was an insult to Geb, the god of the earth. The very soil the Egyptians walked upon rose up to devour them. These were not ordinary insects. They were tiny biting demons that crawled into the eyes, the ears, and the nostrils of the people. For the priests of Egypt, who were required to be perfectly hairless and clean to enter their temples, this was the ultimate desecration. They were covered in crawling filth that they could not wash away. Jannes and Jambres reached into their satchels of ritual dust, chanting the names of the ancient protectors of the earth. But for the first time, their magic failed. The air remained silent. The demons they usually commanded were cowering in the presence of a greater authority. Giannis turned to Pharaoh, his face pale and bitten by the insects, and whispered the words that would echo through history. "This is the finger of Elohim." It was no longer a trick. It was no longer a duel of magicians. It was the Creator reclaiming his property. The fourth plague followed, a swarm of Arab, vicious, wild creatures and stinging flies that bypassed the land of Goshen where the Hebrews dwelt. It was a targeted strike. The gods of the air and the beasts, Khepri and Shu, were silent. The sacred halls of the Pharaoh were filled with the buzzing of death. The priests were now hiding in their inner sanctums, their flesh raw and bleeding from the relentless assault. They realized that their rituals were being used against them. Every prayer they offered to their idols seemed to invite more pain. The structure of Egyptian society, built on the harmony of the gods, was collapsing into chaotic, bloody pieces. But even as the land groaned under the weight of the swarms and the stench of the dead frogs, Moses stood unmoved. He knew, and I, the destroyer, knew, that these were merely the opening movements of a symphony of judgment. The pride of Egypt was a tall tower, and it would take more than insects and blood to bring it down. The sun still shone above, the great Ra, the king of their pantheon. They still had their light. They still had their warmth. They did not yet know that the Creator was about to reach into the sky and snuff out the sun like a guttering candle. The true darkness, the darkness that can be felt, was moving through the cosmos, drawing closer with every heartbeat. The worst was not the blood or the bugs. The worst was the silence that was coming. The silence of the destroyer. Imagine a darkness so dense it could be felt like wet wool against your skin. Imagine trying to scream, but the air is so heavy with the essence of the abyss that the sound dies in your throat. This was not a mere absence of light. It was the arrival of a primordial void, a physical manifestation of judgment that turned the golden kingdom of Egypt into a tomb of living shadows. For 3 days, time stood still. For 3 days, the mighty Pharaoh, the supposed son of the sun god Ra, sat paralyzed on his throne, unable to see his own hand, hearing only the rhythmic, terrifying breathing of a land that was being swallowed by the supernatural. This was the prelude to the end. The 9th plague was a psychological execution before the physical one began. As we stand on the precipice of the final judgment, we must ask, what kind of power can turn the day into a tangible nightmare? Why did the gods of Egypt, the lords of magic and light, flee in terror before this encroaching gloom? Today, we peel back the layers of history and myth to reveal the terrifying truth of the night the destroyer walked the earth. This is not the story you heard in Sunday school. This is the raw, visceral account of a divine war, where the stakes were the souls of an entire nation, and the blood on the doorframe was the only thing standing between life and an eternal, silent scream. Before we descend further into the heart of this ancient darkness, I must ask you to join our circle. These mysteries are deep, and the truths we uncover here are often hidden from the world. If you seek the knowledge that lies beneath the surface of the sacred texts, if you wish to understand the true nature of the battle between light and shadow, then subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. Do not let the destroyer pass you by in the silence. Stay connected to the truth that sets us free. The 18th dynasty of Egypt was the zenith of human arrogance and occult mastery. In the grand halls of Thebes and Memphis, the pharaohs were not just kings. They were considered living conduits of the divine. Their priests were masters of the Heka, the ancient magic that sought to command the very elements. But into this world of gilded idols and secret incantations stepped a man who had once been one of them. I, Moses, returned to the land of my youth, not with the polished spells of the Egyptian academies, but with the raw, unyielding power of the one who is. The plagues were not random accidents of nature. They were surgical strikes against the pantheon of Egypt. When the Nile turned to blood, it was the execution of Hapi. When the frogs rotted in heaps, it was the humiliation of Heket. We have seen the magicians of Pharaoh crumble, their own skin betraying them as the dust of the earth turned to gnats. They admitted it themselves. It is the finger of God. Yet the heart of the king remained as hard as the basalt of the pyramids. He believed his gods would eventually answer. He believed the sun would always rise. He did not know that the Creator was about to turn out the lights of his world entirely. We are now entering the most terrifying chapter of this exodus, the moment when the spiritual war becomes physical, and the entity known as the Mashhit, the destroyer, is summoned from the celestial courts to settle the debt of 400 years of slavery. The 3 days of darkness were a transition, a portal opening between the world of the living and the realm of the silent. In those 72 hours, Egypt was effectively removed from the map of the living. Apocryphal scrolls and the whispered traditions of our elders tell us that the Choshek was a mist harvested from the very bowels of Gehenna. It was cold, yet it did not freeze. It was dark, yet it burned the eyes. For the Egyptians, it was a sensory deprivation that led to a collective madness. Within that silence, they were forced to confront their own sins. They heard the voices of the Hebrew babies they had cast into the Nile. They heard the cracking of the whips and the groans of the dying slaves. The darkness was a mirror. Pharaoh himself sat in a silence so profound that he could hear the beating of his own heart, and it sounded to him like the drums of an approaching army. The Egyptians tried to light torches, but the darkness was like a physical sponge that soaked up the fire, leaving only the smell of burnt wood and the cold touch of the void. They could not even stand up to go to the bathroom or find a cup of water. They were stuck in whatever position they were in when the plague hit. It was a prison of the senses. Imagine the terror of a mother who can hear her child crying just 2 feet away, but cannot see her, cannot reach her, because the air has become a wall of black glass. Meanwhile, in the land of Goshen, there was light. But it was not the light of the sun. It was the Shekinah, the internal glow of the divine presence. It was in this eerie, divided world that the final command was given. "Take a lamb," the voice said, "a lamb without blemish." To the Egyptians, the ram was the sacred image of Khnum, the creator of bodies, and Amun, the king of gods. By taking these lambs, the Hebrews were committing an act of supreme spiritual defiance. They were told to slaughter the gods of their masters. The blood, vibrant, red, and full of life, was to be collected in basins. Then, using a bunch of hyssop, we were to strike the lintels and the 2 side posts of our doors. This was the Tav, the mark of the covenant. It was not a secret signal for God, but a shield. I told the people, "The destroyer is coming. He is the Mashhit, the one who executes the sentence of the firstborn." This entity is not a creature of malice, but a force of absolute, uncompromising justice. He does not possess a human heart. He possesses a divine mandate. He is the shadow of the Almighty's hand. I felt him as a pressure in the atmosphere, a tightening of the very fabric of space. He was waiting at the borders of time, his wings vast as the desert winds ready to unfold. The instructions were strict. None of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning. To step outside was to step into the path of a celestial scythe. We huddled inside, the aroma of the roasted Passover lamb filling our nostrils, a scent of life amidst the stench of the decaying Egyptian spirit. We heard the sound of the wind beginning to pick up, but it was not a wind of air. It was a wind of spirit. It was the sound of the Mashhit's approach. He was checking the frequencies. He was looking for the blood. The blood on the door was a sign that a life had already been given, that the debt had been paid. Where there was no blood, the debt remained, and the destroyer would collect it in person. The tension was a cord pulled so tight it was about to snap. The Egyptians, finally released from their 3-day paralysis as the darkness began to lift slightly into a gray, haunted twilight, found themselves in a world that felt fundamentally wrong. They did not know that the silence of the upcoming midnight would be the last thing many of them would ever hear. I stood in the center of my home, my staff in hand, my loins girded, ready for the flight. I could feel the entity's presence now, a cold, towering shadow that moved through the streets of Egypt like a predator through tall grass. I watched as my brothers and sisters applied the blood to their homes. They knew that tonight, the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural were being erased. The Mashhit was not a story anymore. He was a vibration in the ground. I remember the look in the eyes of the elders, a mixture of awe and absolute dread. They understood that the God of Abraham was no longer just a promise. He was an active, terrifying reality. The destroyer, the Mashhit, does not argue. He does not negotiate. He is the perfect instrument of the law. As I walked through the camp for the last time before the sunset, I saw the blood drying on the wood, turning from a bright crimson to a deep, dark brown. It looked like a seal of fire in the spiritual realm. I told them to eat in haste, with their sandals on their feet. There was no time for leisure. The atmosphere was vibrating with the frequency of the coming judgment. Every Egyptian home was now a target, and every Hebrew home was a fortress, not because of the strength of its walls, but because of the power of the seal. The air grew thin, and a strange, rhythmic thrumming began to echo through the valley of the Nile. It was the sound of the destroyer's wings. The lamb was eaten. The blood was dry. The night was here. The air in Memphis did not just grow cold, it grew heavy, as if the very atmosphere had turned to lead. It was the midnight of all midnights. I, Moses, stood within the humble dwelling of my brothers, the smell of roasted lamb still thick in the air. But my spirit was not in the room. My spirit was out there, in the streets of the world's greatest empire, witnessing the arrival of the breath of God. The entity did not arrive with the sound of trumpets or the clashing of swords. It arrived as a silence so profound it felt like the deafening roar of an ocean. This was the Mashhit, the destroyer. It was not a demon, nor a fallen spirit, but the pure, terrifying execution of divine will. To the Egyptians, it was the shadow that eclipsed their sun god, Ra. To us, it was the final seal of our liberation. The Mashhit moved through the grand avenues of Memphis and the sprawling complexes of Thebes with a terrifying grace. It did not care for the gold-plated pillars of the temples or the massive statues of granite that the pharaohs had built to immortalize their names. It ignored the treasures of the treasury and the silk of the harems. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, sought only one thing: the spark of life that belonged to the firstborn. As the entity drifted through the city, the very shadows seemed to flee from its path. It passed by the houses of the Hebrews, where the scarlet stain of the lamb's blood glowed with an otherworldly luminescence. To the Mashhit, that blood was a barrier of fire, a sign of the covenant that it could not cross. But where there was no blood, there was no mercy. It did not strike with a blade, it simply withdrew the breath. It was a harvest of souls, a quiet, cold reaping that spared neither the son of the slave girl at the mill nor the heir to the throne of the two lands. In the great palace, the pharaoh sat on his throne of ivory, surrounded by his magicians who had long since run out of spells. He had defied the Creator 9 times, but the 10th was not a challenge, it was a sentence. I remember the exact moment the Mashhit entered the royal chambers. A sudden, unnatural frost coated the gold ornaments. The oil lamps flickered blue, and then died. There was a soft gasp from the adjoining room, the chamber of the prince, the one destined to be a god-king. And then, a silence more terrifying than any scream. When the pharaoh finally stood, his legs trembling, he walked into his son's room, only to find a cold statue of flesh. The living god of Egypt was holding a corpse. The scream that erupted from his throat was not just the cry of a grieving father, it was the sound of a 3,000-year-old religion shattering. His gods, Osiris, Anubis, Horus, had been proven to be nothing but carvings of rock. They could not protect his blood, and they could not stop the hand of the one true king. By dawn, the lamentation was so loud it seemed to shake the foundations of the pyramids. There was not a single Egyptian house where someone did not lie dead. The pride of Egypt was broken. The magicians burned their scrolls, and the priests tore their linen robes. The very spine of the empire had been snapped in a single night of divine judgment. Pharaoh, once so arrogant, now begged us to leave. He did not command, he pleaded. He realized that to keep us was to court total extinction. As the sun began to rise, the sight was one that will be etched into the stars forever. Millions of souls, men, women, children, and their livestock, began to march out of the gates of the cities. We did not leave as fugitives. We left as victors, carrying the spoils of a nation that had tried to enslave us. Behind us, the great stone idols of Egypt lay in the shadows of the morning, looking small and insignificant against the horizon of the desert. The Mashhit had finished its work, and the path to the wilderness was open. We walked toward the Red Sea, leaving behind the ruins of a civilization that thought it was eternal. The power of the pharaoh was gone, replaced by the pillar of cloud that led our way. This was the end of the old world and the birth of a new destiny. But the shadows of the past never truly stay buried. The secrets of that night and the entities that walked the earth before and after still linger in the dark corners of history. If you felt the weight of this story, if you want to uncover the forbidden truths that the world has tried to hide, then you must join us. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and prepare your heart for what comes next. Tell me in the comments, which mystery about the Nephilim giants or the occult secrets of King Solomon do you want me to reveal next? Your choice will guide our next journey into the unknown.